That's true.
Okay. And I'm hoping, hey, live now. There it is. Now it's getting recorded on YouTube. I can wave and make sure it's going to work. Wonder if my internet's struggling as well.
I didn't think it would connect to the Wi-Fi very easily if we were too far over.
I think that's a good idea.
Unfortunately, our Wi-Fi is not super human charged or super Wi-Fi charged to reach really far. So,
Yeah. Ours does okay, but
yeah.
even okay. Well, that only took 12 minutes. So, who was it last week? Was it me and Molly?
I think so.
Oh yeah, so we got the transition to the new section.
Mm-hmm.
So we did chapter 8, which was kind of cool. Well, I say kind of cool. It was thought-provoking, also really tragic and terrible. The Israelites kind of snub God, turn around and like, yeah, we've had enough of your way. We want our way. We want to copy the other nations. And so we talked about that. We had a long chat about discerning what God's will is and what God's saying. It's like crisis moments. How for the nation that they were in kind of panic mode and made a bad choice in that situation. That's kind of interesting. But I guess the most surprising thing about the last chapter was that God says, yes, okay, you want to do this terrible thing, okay, I will grant your request. So we talked a bit about why God might have done that as well. So that was interesting. But now, the man, cometh the hour, cometh the man, although not quite, as we're going to see. But yeah, Saul arrives. And so we get our introductions. And kind of interesting. Samuel's in his twilight years. So it's a bit of that's what we've got to remember from the last chapter as well, is the biblical model was for a judge to train up his sons. So it was supposed to be a sort of, family dynasty kind of thing. And Samuel's sons, not so good. So yeah, actually we had an interesting chat about that as well, about parenting. But yeah, it's into that kind of void of the people we thought were going to lead are not leading, and we've asked God to provide, and Samuel said, okay, God's going to do this, everyone go home. And so it's almost like limbo time. Samuel's on his way out because he's getting really old, or at least the people can see the end of Saul's term as leader. So interesting context. Right, I'll read a few verses. So, there was a Benjamite, a man of standing, whose name was Kish, son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Bechorath, the son of Aphiah of Benjamin. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Okay. Maybe we should do smaller sections. I was like, if I start the next bit of the story, I'm going to read a whole page.
That next part's long.
Yeah, the next bit's long. So here he is. I was interested to see pointed out the parallel between the genealogy of Saul and the genealogy of Samuel. That both are kind of, the structure is the same, of like giving the same amount of genealogy and things like this. It's like we're being invited to contrast Samuel and Saul. That was an interesting little thing I wouldn't have noticed because that was chapters ago and I've forgotten it. But yeah, we got this impressive young man without equal. It's such a double entendre. I love this. So they said, we want a king like the other nations. And saying he's without equal is saying like he was the best they had, like no one was as good as he was. But it's also a way of saying he wasn't like an Israelite, right? No one else was. He wasn't like everyone else. So, yeah, I like there's a little irony in the way he's being described. Man, the author of this book just wove the layers together so cleverly. And then, yeah, being tall. So this is something I had to look up. This is the only Israelite who is noted for being tall. The only other people in the Old Testament noted as being tall are the enemies of Yahweh.
Interesting
Yeah.
comparison.
But again, it's a double entendre.
Mm-hmm.
What you want in a warrior king is someone who's like, is going to kick butt. So big strapping lad, but also not so good.
I mean, it doesn't really say, because my translation says he was impressive, and impressive. The word impressive is used twice.
Yeah.
Like we hear that word and we think it's like, oh, he was probably so great. And if you've never heard the story before and you're just reading through it, you're going, I wonder what's going to make him so great or so impressive. But then on the other hand, if you have heard the story before and you listen to it and you read this, you go, oh, there's something ironic in that statement, knowing what comes ahead. So you're either like expecting something like positive to happen, or you getting to endure what you're to see in the next couple of chapters.
Yeah, I think we just about caught that. You're breaking up a bit there. It's it's interesting as well, like that idea of being impressive. So this is jumping ahead a bit. I don't know if we'll get this far today, but in chapter 10, where is it? I've lost it. I know it's here somewhere. It's where he talks about the whole nation are desiring the family of Kish. Okay, well, we will get there at some point. I promise I'm not making it up. But at some point, Saul says, that the whole family. Oh, maybe it's in chapter 9. That's why I can't find it, because it's later in chapter 9.
Oh, if it's in chapter 9, I think that's verse 20.
Yeah, like verse 19 and 20. Mm-hmm. So he's like saying to Saul, to whom is all the desire of Israel turned? Uh-huh. But actually the word desire, that word has negative connotations, and most of the time in the Old Testament that word is translated more not as desire, but as to covet. And so the Israelites have got an unhealthy desire for something, and Saul is fulfilling that for them. So the fact that it's, again, that impressive has got these overtones of like impressive for the wrong reasons. All right. Yeah. It's time for the dance around the donkeys.
I want to mention one thing too, that I think there's some sort of ominous fact here that he's a Benjaminite as well.
Yeah.
And the last major story in the Bible of the Benjaminites is not
positive.
It's not a good one. There's not a whole lot of hope that came out of that story. In fact, it's still probably one of the hardest chapters in all of the Bible to wrestle with. Mm-hmm. Is like the last few chapters of Judges, and so I think there's something to the fact that just the first king being a Benjaminite is not something you're supposed to read and go, oh yeah, there's something great is gonna come out of this one. He seems like just the right guy.
Yeah. And like more details about his family are going to come out. It's not just that he's a Benjamite, but he's of the exact tribe that committed one of the most heinous sins in the Book of Judges. So it's like, yeah. But again, like I was reading up on the geography of this a little bit. Like Benjamin, geographically within Israel, was ideally placed to be like a capital, to be a center of power, to diffuse tensions between the other tribes, and be a good place from which to defend the country against the Philistines. So from a worldly point of view, it made total sense. But from a spiritual point of view, the heritage, like the story of that tribe, has not been leading in a good direction. So again, you got the juxtaposition of impressive for the wrong reasons. And yeah. All right. Let's why don't you guys read a bit? There's got to be some English play on words we can do here with like chasing his own asses. Like I'm not quite sure. It's too late in the evening to be clever with words, but there's something there.
There's three. We'll see where I end up stopping. I don't know. All right, verse 3. Now the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. So Kish said to his son Saul, "Take now with you one of the servants and arise, go search for the donkeys." He passed through the hill country of Ephraim and passed through the land of did not find them. Then they passed through the land of Shalim, but they were not there. Then he passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they did not find them. When they came to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant who was with him, "Come, and let us return, or else my father will cease to be concerned about the donkeys and will become anxious for us." He said to him, "Behold, now there is a man of God in this city, and the man is held in honor. All that he says surely comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us about our journey on which we have set out." Then Saul said to his servant, "But behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is gone from our sack, and there is no present to bring to the man of God. What do we have?" The servant answered Saul again and said, "Behold, I have in my hand a fourth of a shekel of silver. I will give it to the man of God, and he will tell us our way." Formerly in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, he used to say, "Come and let us go to the seer." For he who is called a prophet now was formerly called a seer. Then Saul said to the servant, "Well said, come, let us go." So they went to the city where the man of God was. As they went up the slope to the city, they found young women going out to draw water and said to them, "Is the seer here?" They answered them and said, "He is. See, he is ahead of you. Hurry now, for he has come into the city today, for the people have a sacrifice on the high place today. As soon as you enter the city, you will find him before he goes up to the high place to eat. For the people will not eat until he comes, because he must bless the sacrifice. Afterward, those who are invited will eat. Now therefore, go up, for you will find him at once." So they went up to the city. As they came into the city, behold, Samuel was coming out toward them to go up to the high place.
Cool.
All right.
It is a long section.
Such an
Indeed.
interesting part of the story.
Indeed.
Yeah. It's interesting as well because it appears a bit of a strange, at least to our mind. Like if you want to announce someone as king, like all the stories of like European battles for thrones and things like that were all a matter of getting some young heir to their coronation as quickly as possible, make it public as quickly as possible. But for Saul and for David, they both had like a private encounter with their call before they had a public encounter with it. And so this is going to be Saul's private reckoning with what his future can look like. So yeah, it's a little bit different than we might expect, I guess. So the whole donkeys thing is a bit weird because it goes into excruciating detail about this. But Israel's leaders were consistently portrayed as being skilled shepherds, which is language that the prophets pick up to carry on talking about what epitomizes a good leader, a good shepherd. And so then it's really noteworthy that the first thing, well, not the first thing, we've learned that Saul's from like a good family, well, not good family, family of standing, powerful, wealthy family, and like who his dad is. We learn that stuff. But the first thing we learn that's personal to him is he's an impressively incompetent shepherd. Like he's roaming over like a 20-mile region looking for a few donkeys that have gone missing, who actually end up wandering back home. Like they can't have gone far. And he's just so out of his way. And I mean, I don't think the story is necessarily telling this, but the fact that he ends up with like, oh man, my dad's going to be worried about me, is like, yeah, when left to your own devices, trying to help these donkeys, it ends so badly that even your own safety then is at risk. So it's just cataclysmically bad, you know, given that skill set that a shepherd was supposed to have.
It also doesn't bode well in hope of how he's going to lead either. If he can't keep track of a couple of donkeys, how is he supposed to keep good watch over God's people who have been trusted to him? So you don't have a lot of hope in his leadership skills from the story.
Yeah. Which we've already had, like the contrast with Eli, the priest who could not see what was going on, and Samuel knew what was going on because he listened to God. And now that is, it's like that contrast is replaying again, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And then I love the introduction of the servant into the story. So despite the fact that Samuel's home base was like a few miles away from where Saul lived, Saul had clearly never heard of Samuel, didn't know who he was when he met him, didn't know that there was a man of God, despite the fact that the entire nation knew about him. He's in the dark about the fact that there's a national prophet. And then not only that, he casts Samuel in the mold of the prophets of the other nations and presumes that, oh, if we're going to get his help, we'll need to pay him off, which is not what the prophets of Yahweh do.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, it's like the worldliness of the other nations. Like, yeah, that's it. Saul represents the other nations. He's doing things that way and is oblivious to what God's been doing right on his doorstep. So, yeah, because we all read this and we're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. He wants some money, yada, yada, yada. But actually, this is supposed to be surprisingly, I don't know, surprisingly surprising. It's supposed to shock us.
I think it's interesting too, because calling him a seer, like it's not like they mention the seer versus prophet and then continue to call him a prophet. The author points out, like, keeps calling him a seer. And then I think it's really fascinating that in verses 12 and 13, and 14 and going forward, the place to offer is referred to as the high place. And while we don't have to doubt whether or not Samuel was actually worshiping the Lord, we know he was. But the fact that that's the phraseology that the author's choosing to use, I just think is really interesting, because we're already seeing the comparison between they're kind of seeing him like a seer from the other nations, and then Saul's kind of portrayed as like not really in tune with where Israel is. And then on top of that, they're saying like Samuel was going to offer sacrifice at the high place. Again, we know he's not sacrificing to other gods, but that phraseology will set off a trigger in our heads going, oh, high places. They don't tear down high places. Yeah. The high places were places of idolatry. And so you kind of have this like weird undercurrent of a comparison here that the author's being very strategic with his words to try and set the picture for who this Saul person is, and almost like foreshadowing what's to come.
Yeah, because it used to be that the tabernacle worship was in Shiloh, but in the beginning, like when the ark got taken, that probably was sacked. And so in the absence of being able to do things the way they normally did, yeah, maybe there's a kind of, the second best looks like borrowing from what the other nations are doing. Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is, I think it says so much about Saul's lack of relationship with Yahweh. So
Yeah.
even though he didn't have any money, his response to, shall we go and see the seer, was not, well, I haven't got any money, but let's go see. His response was, no, probably not. You know, there's just no enthusiasm, or I don't know. It doesn't look like there's much importance placed on what Yahweh's input could be. It doesn't seem a big deal to him to be able to go and ask Yahweh. So, yeah, that's just, just seems a million miles away from Samuel, who right from an early age is hearing God's voice and responding. Just you couldn't get more different, these two. Yeah.
Man.
Yeah, it's almost like Saul has to get convinced by the servant.
Right, which is just a juxtaposition of power too, right? He's the son of Kish, so he should be the one calling the shots.
Yeah.
Kind of just shows his, this is not a real word, but his swayability, his ability to be kind of just move around. So yeah, and this what's interesting about stories like this is, upon the first read, it almost seems like, what's the point? Why are we talking about this? Like, I'm just going to keep reading because the stories to come are way more interesting. But when we slow down and really pick pieces out and then compare them with what we've seen and what we know is coming, we catch those little things much easier.
Mm-hmm.
That's why going slow is so huge, is because as we take time to actually meditate on the words and think about them, we catch those things and we're like, that's interesting. I never caught that before because I was just trying to get the part where David comes in, or where, Saul has his demise, or whatever the big stories are, David and Goliath, but there's so much weight behind these things that really help push those big stories in our minds forward.
Yeah. I wonder whether maybe even meeting the young girls drawing water in the evening is meant to amplify that point. He doesn't know where Samuel lives. Like, so he's having to be directed by like one of the least powerful in society.
Yikes.
Are we? No.
Can you hear us? Hello.
Well, we thought outside would be a good idea. Nice change of scenery.
Oh, looks like we might be the host now.
Hello, everyone.
If this really stuck. Well, that would have been hilarious if we thought we were the ones going blank and everyone's watching us not go blank. Well, we'll see if we get a text.
Hey
there.
That was weird.
Yeah, my internet just shut off. You guys froze, and I was like, what's going on? And I don't know what went on. But
I wonder if it still was streaming, because both of us were just sitting here like, if we were the ones on that, that's every day's an adventure.
Yeah, I don't know. Want to check. I know it looks like it's still streaming. It's still trying to. I think it's. If we all wave, and we can look and see on Facebook whether the wave turns up anytime soon. Okay, I can see me waving on Facebook, so there we go. I'm presuming we're all good to go. So yeah, we've got the young girls. So that's when you guys froze, was when I was talking about the young girls.
Yep.
The least powerful in the town, the least authoritative in the town, were the ones who had to act as guides to the future king. So yeah,
Jeez.
more interesting stuff. But then,
Well-
then you meet Samuel.
Should I keep reading at verse 15?
Yeah, where did we get to? That's right, isn't it? Verse 15, yeah.
All right. Now, the day before Saul's arrival, the Lord had informed Samuel, "At this time tomorrow, I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him ruler over my people Israel. He will save them from the Philistines, because I have seen the affliction of my people, for their cry has come to me." When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord told him, "Here's the man I told you about. He will govern my people." Saul approached Samuel in the city gate and asked, "Would you please tell me where the seer's house is?" "I am the seer," Samuel answered. "Go up ahead of me to the high place and eat with me today. When I send you off in the morning, I'll tell you everything that's in your heart. As for the donkeys that wandered away from you 3 days ago, don't worry about them, because they've been found. And who does all Israel desire but you and all your father's family?"
That's probably good.
Yeah, I think it's a good spot.
Yeah. If you keep going, you'll keep going
Keep going.
quite a while. Again,
Fair.
I love this. So you've had like indecisive, needing a guide, not quite sure what to do, Saul, and then Samuel's just like totally in charge, knows exactly what's going on. He's just bossing it. The contrast is so striking. I think it's really interesting the way that God spoke to Samuel ahead of time.
Mhm.
It just, instead of Samuel's relationship with Yahweh being like reactive, so Saul is going to go because he's got a need that he can't do anything about, and so it's like a last resort is to connect with God. Whereas Samuel, it's not as situations are unfolding, God's intervening. But even before the story has got going, God and Samuel have been talking about this. It just displays such a different relationship with God.
Mm-hmm.
But I think sometimes we fall into there's actually 3 relationships here. There's the I'm just not inquiring of Yahweh. There's the reactive, I'm going to use Yahweh a bit like an ATM when I've got problems. And then you've got the kind of rich, like Samuel is doing life with Yahweh.
Mhm.
You know, like he just epitomizes something to be aimed at here.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm impressed when I feel like God showed me something after I've like fasted and prayed and sought him for 10 days. Like how awesome would it be to just be so tight with him that like every day I'm getting insights into tomorrow and next week. And, you know, it's not that it doesn't happen, but it's just, it's not written about here as being a profound event, but just like par for the course for Samuel. Like, yeah, this is what Samuel and Yahweh do. Yahweh speaks to him, like lets him know what's going on, gives him the inside scoop, you know.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah. It's funny because he doesn't, like, he's not been told by Saul about the donkeys, but he's like already knows that that's clearly the first thing and only thing Saul really cares about at this point.
That
So
is
it makes
such
the
a
point
mic drop moment.
Yes, it's like he says, "And I know you're worried about your donkeys. Don't worry about them. Just leave them be. I've got another thing that we're working on right now.
Yeah.
So just don't get sidetracked. Don't even ask. They're fine."
That is so cool. Just like as a second, like as an afterthought.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But again, like the fact that that the thing that is most important to Saul is an afterthought to Samuel shows that Samuel just has such a different perspective.
Yeah.
Which, oh my goodness, like is that a practical lesson for us? My goodness, like when we get consumed with our practical needs, how easy it might be to not have like God's perspective on things.
Yeah.
You know? So it's so easy to become a little bit consumed by the problem we're trying to solve and maybe end up a little bit like Saul.
Mm-hmm.
There's some interesting words in here as well. Like when Samuel says, "This is the one I've said, he will govern my people."
Hmm.
I'm interested because I think you guys have a different translation. So mine says in verse 17, "He will govern my people." What does yours say?
Mine says govern.
Yours says govern as well. So actually, the Hebrew word can equally well be translated restrain or imprison my people.
Jeez.
So it's got these negative overtones again. The majority of the occurrences in the rest of the New Testament, it's a negative word talking about constraining people rather than, so we're getting all these negative overtones in the wordplay going on through this section. Yeah, kind of interesting. I also like that as God's talking to Samuel about it. So the last chapter, Yahweh is really frank. He says, "Hey, my people have rejected me." Like that's hurtful,
Yeah.
bad thing to happen. And here God is stepping in, actually enabling their request to have another person lead them, a king, but he's still calling them my people.
Mm.
So just like the little details that God's covenant faithfulness to his people is still there, even though his people are in just pretty bad place.
Yeah. And the fact that we get some pretty clear Exodus language in verse 16. I've seen the affliction of my people, for their cry has come to me.
Yeah.
Like you are remembered, that covenant that God made with Abraham, and then again with the people at Sinai. But you get that reality that he's committed to them even when they've in effect rejected him.
Yeah. Here's another interesting thing. There's all these like parallels to the rest of the book that I hadn't noticed that I was enjoying reading about. So one is when Samuel comes to Saul, he sees exactly who Saul is. He sees his future. He knows what's going on. When Saul looks at Samuel, all he sees is a stranger. And he completely misreads. He's not able to correctly judge who Samuel is. And actually, when you think about it, that is the pattern, or one of the patterns of Saul's failure. He misreads his son Jonathan as being unworthy. He misreads David as being like a usurper, a treacherous revolutionary. He misreads Ahimelech as being a conspirator. Like he's got this pattern of not being able to see who people really are, but just his judgment about people is solely based on this like internal experience, which again like speaks to the danger of that, but speaks to the failure of Saul to make use of the resources that actually he had available to him, which we're going to see in a second. It's not like Samuel had the inside track for sure, but in a minute, Saul's going to be prophesying and like anointed by the Spirit, and it's not like there was some fundamental reason that he couldn't have connected with Yahweh and got the right perspective. Yeah. Yeah. The other thing about Samuel just dropping in there about the donkeys is he preempts Saul's trying to pay for it. He just gives it for free. I wonder if Yahweh told Samuel to do that. That would be kind of cool.
That's funny. Yeah, I don't know.
And then he invites him to this meal. So this is interesting because within the Middle Eastern sort of customs, if you had a guest, giving them the place of honor and feeding them and showing them hospitality was the normal thing to do. But it seems that Samuel is going above and beyond that in the eyes of the people watching. They'd be like, oh, this is weird. Why is he showing so much honor and deference?
Yeah.
This person. So in some ways it's normal, but it's a little bit super normal as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I love that. I mean, what do you make of this in verse 19? The whole, you're going to eat with me, you're going to be my guest, and tomorrow, I'll look after you tonight. Tomorrow you can go, and I'll tell you all that is in your heart. Now that's really interesting to me because I don't know. Hopefully, we'll have time here to read it into the next chapter. Because what Samuel tells Saul is news to him, and actually surprises him. And God and Samuel are going to have to do a bit of work to change Saul's mind about the way he thinks about himself. So I wonder what we're supposed to infer by these words. I'll tell you all that's in your heart. Because it doesn't seem like the things he told him were in his heart. I don't know. Have you guys ever thought about that? Like, what does this mean? I find that really confusing. We're now going to have five minutes of quiet thinking time that we're going to broadcast while we try and figure this out.
To me, I mean, not that there's probably more to this, but I've always just understood that part to speak to kind of Samuel's affirmation of his prophetness, of saying like, I don't need you to pay me for my services, but more than that, I hear from the Lord and I'm going to act accordingly. And, and basically I hear from the Lord about who you are and what you're going to be doing. I'll definitely have to think more about how that speaks to the kind of person that Saul is and what he thinks. Because it's interesting, because you have this kind of like, when we get in the latter half of chapter 10, probably next week, when Saul hides, you get this like sense of like, wow, he's like this really shy, behind the scenes, quiet guy. But again, if you know the story or if you keep reading, he comes across so much more arrogant and self-important and self-righteous, that you have to wonder how that relates to this like person that we see here, because it feels like there was almost a 180-degree difference between the two people, between the one person in the two instances, but it is the same person. And I always wonder in these instances, like why God says things like, anoint him ruler, I've chosen him, here's the man I told you about, he's going to do it. It's just an interesting choice on God's part, but maybe also good at the same time that he's not full of pride to begin with, because then it would have looked like God intentionally.
Yeah. See, I'm not sure he's not. I'm not sure he's not full of pride.
Not obvious. It's not yet, but almost like I'm going to show, like God's allowing this person to come into power to show that he's human and that he's going to make choices that the Lord wouldn't, Lord wouldn't have made, and that the Lord obviously is sovereign over, and showing from the beginning that it's evolution, the negative evolution. Not that he's really fantastic to begin with, but the development of Saul throughout the next little bit.
See, I wonder whether what we're being invited to think about with Saul, he appears humble, but then I think the way the story plays out, that we may be supposed to look back and think, oh, he wasn't humble. He was just afraid of stepping up to his call. Because of the way that fear very quickly becomes a dominant motivator for his other actions once he actually takes hold of power. It's almost like he was afraid of picking up the power and authority that he was called to. But then, it's just an interesting one. I'll have to sort of keep that in mind as we read the story unfolding. I wonder whether the whole tell you what's in your heart as well, is kind of not tell you what you're already thinking, but tell you what's there that you don't see yet.
Yeah.
Deep down.
Yeah. Like,
don't psychologists say that there's 3 levels of consciousness, and that there's a lot of things that happen in the sub and unconscious part of our mind and our brain of thinking? So maybe there's unconscious or subconscious things that brew in Saul's mind that he's not really aware consciously that he thinks these things or feels those things or acts those ways. I mean, we do that as humans, right? Like, I say something and I'm not meaning something by that, or I'm not thinking about all that what I'm saying could entail, until someone comes in and says, like, hey, did you not realize that you know, and starts poking at that. There's like this unspoken stream of consciousness.
So much is, I mean, who was it we were talking with? We were talking with someone yesterday, Anna and I, about how we met, and talking about, you know, we were young and we were flirting, and she's telling the story, and I said, well, you know, of course I was completely oblivious to the fact that any of this was going on, like, because my non-conscious was clearly engaged, but yeah, my consciousness was not.
That's funny.
Yeah, so we can clearly do this.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so should we read, is it verse 21 we got up to?
Yes.
Yeah. So Saul answers, but am I not a Benjamite, from the smallest tribe of Israel, and is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribes of Benjamin? Why do you say such a thing to me? Then Samuel brought Saul and his servant into the hall and seated them at the head of those who were invited, about 30 people. Samuel said to the cook, bring the piece of meat I gave you, the one I told you to lay aside. So the cook took up the leg with what was on it and set it in front of Saul. Samuel said, here is what has been kept for you. Eat, because it was set aside for you for this occasion, from the time I said, I have invited guests. And Saul dined with Samuel that day. So we've already talked about the tribe of Benjamin and Saul's heritage not being great. But now here's the $1 million question. This is this humility thing, right? Is this just Middle Eastern cultural deference? You know, like, oh, which is like when we say to someone who gives us a gift, oh, you shouldn't have. Or is this like true humility? Like, is he just in disbelief that he could be chosen? Or is there something else? Is it something other than humility driving his either unwillingness or inability to see himself as who Samuel sees him as?
It's interesting.
I wonder if the story so far is actually intentionally trying to leave us with that as an unresolved question. Because, I mean, the story that's about to be told in the books of Samuel is not just about Saul, it's about David. And I wonder whether it's when we get to David that more contrasts will bring into focus what was really going on. Because David, for sure, has a clear grasp that compared to Yahweh, he is unworthy to be in partnership with him. So, but Saul doesn't mention Yahweh. He just talks about how he's viewed socially.
Yeah.
No. Or maybe he is aware of the spiritual stuff. I don't know.
It almost leaves it open-ended, at least for me. I read, you know, these first couple narratives of Saul, and I almost put myself in his shoes, and then I'm caused to almost reflect back on how I respond to different things that are presented to me. And I feel like sometimes the biblical authors will intentionally leave things more open like this, that it's not, you know, as explicit, because sometimes we get those explicit statements where we can know exactly what's happening in
yeah
open end, that you're asked to put yourself there and respond, especially in light of what we see coming later with David, respond better than, or depending on who we're studying, in the footsteps of the person. Yeah.
Which, top tip, the Bible Project have got some really cool podcasts and videos about how the Old Testament is Jewish meditation literature. So we would expect this to lay out for us, like in a psychology textbook, exactly what's going on. But the form of writing this is actually inviting us to ponder and keep putting the pieces together. And each time we filter it through, we pick up something different. I love Samuel and the cook. Like, so we have, because here's another contrast. Saul doesn't really get what Yahweh tells him. Like, it kind of goes in one ear and out the other. And he doesn't do what Yahweh tells him. Whereas Samuel heard what Yahweh said, correctly understood it, and acted upon it. Like, even though Saul hadn't turned up yet, he's like, oh, so this dude's coming and I'm going to interact with him. Okay, so I'm going to set that up ahead of time then. I'll make sure I've told the cook to reserve the meat. And yeah, like he'd set the wheels in motion based on what Yahweh had said, not based on what he saw going on.
Yeah.
So we'll have to wait a few chapters to get to Saul monumentally failing to do what Yahweh said. But when that happens, this will be an interesting contrast.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah.
I had this one commentary, I copied out a quote from it about the kind of just how terrible Saul gets. Here it is. He's genealogically linked with the most depraved tribe of the period of the Judges. He's depicted as pastorally incompetent, spiritually ignorant, disobedient, and at times oddly irrational. That's quite an epitaph to have in history, isn't it?
Yes. Oof.
Oh. So there we go. And they eat. And then maybe I could have read verse 25 as well. It's kind of wraps up the evening, I guess, for them. So Saul dines with Samuel, and then verse 25 is after they came down from the high place back to the town, Samuel talked with Saul on the roof of his house. And we don't know what was said. And I'm like, I want to be a fly on the wall of that conversation. Like, that would be interesting. Yeah, because it's the next day that Saul, the penny drops for Saul, like, oh, you're going to anoint me as king. Are you guys, can you hear me?
Just now. You just came back for us.
Yeah, you guys froze. So, what was I saying? Oh yeah, I'd love to be a fly on the wall of that conversation.
Yeah.
But here, I was just thinking about the whole, I'll tell you everything that's in your heart. It's the next morning that the penny drops for Saul that you're going to be king. So that night, they must just have been shooting the breeze about, like, you know, who are you? Tell me about your life, you know. So I wonder if that rooftop conversation was Samuel giving counsel to Saul about just not being a king, but just being a human being or something, you know. And that would be a great get to heaven and ask for the video of that one.
See the live action of this conversation?
Yeah. Okay, it has been nearly an hour, and I think if we keep reading, we're going to end up having to talk about what anointing is, and that's not going to take us 5 minutes. So yeah, I think next week we will pick up in verse 26, and then we'll dive into chapter 10, because there's just too many amazing little nuggets of stuff in here that need talking about. So much thought-provoking stuff. So
yes, indeed. That sounds good. Sounds like
that'll be next time. So we'll leave them on the rooftop, which is kind of like, you know, the cool evening breeze for us sat in our gardens. So we're going to switch off everyone, and
Fitting.
I don't have anyone with me, but Amber's going to tell Ryan everything that's in his heart.
What? I'm excited.
Uh,